Hello, everybody. I hope your 2026 is still getting off to a great start. Since my last episode, the developments within Iran and without, both of which I have followed really closely, have been both very hard to watch, as well as keeping me on the edge of my seat as I'm scheduled to depart for the region in just 9 days. To remind you, about 2 weeks ago, protests broke out all over Iran, ostensibly protesting the collapse of the country's currency owing to an American led international sanctions regime on Iran, as well as the mismanagement of the country's drinking water supply, which is almost entirely depleted. Within Iran, the regime's enforcers are believed to have killed upwards of 20,000 individuals and maybe more. Despite the regime shutting down the internet in order to block images of this massacre from making it out of the country, much footage has seeped through the cracks, making its way to social media platforms such as X. I personally have viewed much of this footage, which is way too graphic to share on YouTube, without my channel earning strikes against it, which I'm not willing to risk. Although I will provide a link in the extended description below my Ko-fi page that links to a video montage of the regime's brutal suppression. This video montage is on the X account of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, who was deposed by this regime of the Ayatollahs back in 1979. But I can tell you that what this footage reveals is incredibly disturbing. Bodies in their myriads of Iranian citizens, mostly the young, and including many women, piled up on sidewalks and on warehouse floors. One of the most moving pictures is this young woman next to the corpse of her sister, shot dead by the regime's forces. The bodies that I have clearly seen in both video footage and still photos shows the victims having been shot in the head and the chest, some obviously point blank. The regime's forces began suppressing the protesters with birdshot shells fired from shotguns, but things eventually devolved into them spraying the crowds with live AK 47 fire. So much for what's happening within Iran. Without Iran, President Trump promised the protesters that help was on the way, strongly insinuating, if not outright declaring, an impending American aerial attack on the regime, either to degrade its ability to kill its own citizens or to overthrow it outright, i.e., regime change. But the help never came. Why? At the time President Trump made this promise, there were no American aircraft carriers anywhere near the region, the closest being at least a week away. Such an American or Israeli attack, for that matter, can only succeed as a finishing touch once the regime has been sufficiently weakened from the inside. Israel is also not entirely prepared to bear the likely withering counterassault by Iran, which could take the form of 500 ballistic missiles being fired at Israel all at one time. Each of these missiles carrying at least a 1-ton warhead. In last summer's 12-day war, which I experienced personally, several of these ballistic missiles penetrated Israel's famous defensive shield, destroying entire apartment blocks and, in some cases, entire blocks in Tel Aviv and other coastal cities along the Mediterranean. Since that war, Israel has not succeeded to replenish its ballistic missile interceptors, namely the Arrow 2 and 3 systems. So, in such a blitzkrieg where Iran fires off 500 ballistic missiles all at once, the damage to lives and property in Israel could be catastrophic. Yet, despite this, I have seen footage on social media out of Israel that many, if not most, of Israel's citizens would be willing to spend the next month back in bomb shelters if this sacrifice guaranteed the fall of Iran's ruling regime and saved the lives of more of Iran's youth. Think about that. I don't remember such an example of altruism by another country's population on behalf of the welfare of a foreign country's citizens nearly 1,000 miles away. In addition to Israel's own concerns, the Arab countries and Emirates in the Persian Gulf have also asked President Trump to refrain from attacking Iran, but for different reasons than Israel's. The Arabs have warned President Trump that if he attacks Iran, oil prices will skyrocket in response. They also confided to him that such an attack would potentially cause uprisings in their own countries, which have significant Shiite minorities in the population. And additionally, these same Arab Gulf countries basically told President Trump that he's not free to use their territories to launch such an attack on Iran. Now, this is important because America's largest base in the region is in nearby Qatar, and Qatar has told President Trump, not ambiguously, but in plain language, that he is not allowed to launch the attack or use this air base from their territory, which of course calls into question what good is this base in Qatar if America is not even allowed to use it when it has to? So, as I said, the help that President Trump declared was on its way never came. But will it? Here's a glimpse into developments over the past 24 hours. The Pentagon has confirmed ongoing movements of air, land, and sea assets to the region. This includes at least four U.S. Air Force C 17A Globemaster heavy cargo planes have been tracked en route to Diego Garcia, a key Indian Ocean base used for staging long range operations. These transports are often precursors to bombing deployments or logistics support for such bombing campaigns. Additionally, open source tracking shows surges in tanker, aircraft, and fighter jets, including F 35s and F 15Es, toward the region, bolstering strike and refueling capabilities. And non essential personnel have been withdrawn from key bases like in nearby Qatar as a precaution against potential Iranian retribution or retaliation. And the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was redirected from the South China Sea on January 15th, with arrival expected in about a week. And a rumor has taken flight that a second aircraft carrier group, the George Herbert Walker Bush aircraft carrier, is also heading to the region to the Mediterranean. But this remains unconfirmed by official sources. Another rumor speaks of Marine Expeditionary Units or brigades with up to 10,000 sailors and Marines being deployed to the region as well. All the above is something like a deployment that's costing something like $6 to $7 billion. But these moves can just as easily be interpreted as being aimed at deterrence and readiness rather than immediate action, with analysts noting U.S. force posture this time is lighter than it was during this recent 12-day war between Israel and Iran back in June. President Trump has also appeared to step back rhetorically, stating that he's holding his fire because Iran canceled its scheduled mass public hanging of 800 protesters in exchange for his restraint. And lastly, and this is so important, the uprising in Iran that's been raging, as I said, for the past 2 weeks seems to have been finally crushed by the regime's brutal suppression. This, more than anything, would quell the impulse to attack Iran, as such an attack, as I said earlier, would have been seen as just the finishing touch to push the uprising past the proverbial goal line for a touchdown. If the uprising has indeed been crushed, this alone argues against attacking the regime. The administration is also speaking of new diplomatic opportunities because of its successful campaign of deterrence vis a vis the Ayatollah. Steve Witkoff, the president's chief negotiator in the region, when speaking at a conference just a couple days ago in Florida, spoke of the administration's desire to resolve things with Iran diplomatically. Witkoff said that such a diplomatic agreement with Iran would address the following issues. Iran would have to entirely stop its nuclear enrichment program, surrender the actual nuclear material that they already have, which is roughly 2,000 kilograms, which is about 4,400 pounds. And as it relates to Iran's ballistic missile production, they would have to cut back on their inventory entirely. And lastly, Iran would be made to pledge to cut its ties off, again, entirely with its proxies in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen. Now, could all this talk of diplomacy just be a strategic deception before an American attack to lull Iran into a false sense of security? The answer to that, of course, is yes. Similar talk of diplomacy was in the air immediately before Israel launched its 12-day war last June. I remember this really well because there was a round of talks between the US and Iran scheduled for just the day after I was scheduled to leave Israel. And rather than those talks ever taking place, Israel, a few days before they were scheduled, opened its dramatic air assault and surprise attack on Iran. So, of course, it's very possible that this is all part of some strategic deception on both America and Israel's part. So, as it relates to the winds of war stirring in Iran, stay tuned. All right. I now want to switch gears entirely from Iran to another subject, conspiracy. For since the end of President Trump's first term in office and its accompanying rise in conspiracy theories like QAnon, conspiracy obsession has been increasing incrementally, seeming to be cresting in our own day. The most popular YouTube channels and platforms, of course, are those that dabble obsessively with it. It reminds me of my own foray into conspiracy theorism in the early 1990s. Back in December 1993, I graduated from Penn State with a BA in International Relations. It was my third major, following my first majoring in accounting, followed by, yes, theater arts. Upon my graduation, my path crossed with that of an old friend of mine from my school days, my grade school and high school days, Phil Goldman. Now, Phil was the stepdad of my childhood friend Jeffrey. Phil was incredibly intelligent, a bona fide math prodigy, in addition to being an entrepreneur. And I was absolutely taken in by this, so much so that back in grade school, every time I went to Jeffrey's house to play ball, my attention would be diverted to Phil, who engaged me in conversations about the burgeoning New World Order. Phil was almost prophetic. He successfully predicted the coming collapse of the Soviet Union, which was still 4 years away, the future devaluation of the US dollar, and the movement from cash to a digital wireless economy and currency. When our paths crossed some 8 years after he made these predictions, he asked me, Steve, what did you study there at Penn State? When I answered international relations, he chuckled and he responded by saying, Forget all that gibberish you learned at Penn State. Now, do you really want to learn who governs the world, Steve? Of course, I replied in the affirmative. We went back to Phil's house a few blocks away from my childhood home, where he showed me his vast library. An entire section of this library was dedicated to this new world order. He handed me a book called Conspirators' Hierarchy: The Story of the Committee of 300. I took the book home that night, and although I'm definitely not a night owl, I read it in one sitting throughout that night. I was absolutely mesmerized and I wanted more. So then Phil hooked me up with another book, The Fourth Reich of the Rich. Now, this book was very in depth, much more than the first, and in my opinion, better argued. Following my reading of that book, I read another, exclusively about the founding of the Federal Reserve, called The Creature from Jekyll Island: A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. As I said, I was hooked and I kept coming back for more. Now, for those of you not familiar with any of these books, just know that they argue that for at least the last couple hundred years, a conspiracy of global elites have been orchestrating a phased takeover of the world. This group includes primarily bankers like the Rothschild family, the Harriman Bush dynasty, from which the two presidents Bush hail from, together with royal families like the British, the Swedish, and other European monarchs, together with Saudi Arabia's royal family, and the Hollywood elite with other shapers of our culture. In modern times, they meet together annually at the Bilderberg Conference, named after the hotel in the Netherlands that the group first met in. To this day, they're called Bilderbergers. Historically, the guest list was so secret that it was hard to ascertain who exactly participated at these conferences. Now, beneath these Bilderbergers are their agencies who influence policy, such as the Council of Foreign Relations, such as the Trilateral Commission. Also, key to this conspiracy are the world's central banks like the Federal Reserve. And beyond these Bilderberger conferences every year, many of the conspirators from the dynasties that I mentioned intermarry with one another. In short, they see themselves as the rightful rulers of the world, and the rest of us as their serfs. Therefore, the Western democracies have to be overthrown or at least come under their control, even if these democracies maintain a facade of democracy. In such a scenario, of course, both the Republican and Democratic parties are each under their control. And any seeming divisions between these parties are just that, seeming, a facade for mass consumption. For 2 whole years back in the mid 1990s, I obsessed with this conspiracy. It started to permeate my whole world view. I never went as far as my friend Phil, who ascribed to these conspirators otherworldly powers like being able to control the weather. Marjorie Taylor Greene, by the way, betrayed a similar belief a few years ago in Jewish space lasers being behind forest fires breaking out in the Pacific Northwest. And by the way, don't forget, the recently resigned from Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was an avid follower of QAnon. But even though I didn't ascribe to the conspiracy these kind of powers, I did in general embrace the overall narrative of a global conspiracy working behind the scenes to bring about one world government under their dominion. Then, all of a sudden, after 2 years of inundating myself with this conspiracy, I quit cold turkey. I started to withdraw from my friend Phil whenever he raised the subject, although we did remain good friends until his death a few years ago. And I didn't altogether come to dismiss the notion of a conspiracy of the global elite, who some also refer to as the Davos crowd, to bring us under global government. And by the way, this was one of the chief selling points of Donald Trump to MAGA, that he's not one of that Davos crowd, but trying to pry America from their grasp. So you may ask, Steve, Why did you step back from all this? Because the Lord started to convict me of the conspiracy theory's chief sin, which is it robs God of his ultimate sovereignty. You see, when you believe, as my friend Phil did and Marjorie Taylor Greene does, that the weather itself is controlled by the conspirators and that nothing happens on Earth without their involvement, you have in effect made the conspiracy God. And God convicted me of this, reminding me of a foundational truth spoken in Proverbs 16:4. The Lord, or Yahweh, has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. He reminded me that he is sovereign and that I need to keep my eyes on him, not conspiracies or conspirators. Elsewhere in the scripture, in Isaiah chapter 8, verses 12 to 14, it says, "Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread." So, for those of you who are believers, and here I'm referring to Bible believers as opposed to believers or disciples of the conspiracy, I want to conclude this episode by encouraging you to stay above all the noise that's the rage on social media platforms about conspiracies of every kind, including the grand conspiracy, and keep your eyes fixed on the Lord. And with that last bit of encouragement, I can bring this episode to an end. Now, for those of you that want to treat me to a cup of coffee, you can do so by following the link to my coffee page below the video in the extended description of the video. And I promised that below the link to that coffee page, I would provide a link to a post on X by Reza Pahlavi, the Crown Prince of Iran. It's about a 3.5 minute montage of what's gone on in Iran the past couple weeks. It is very graphic, which is why I couldn't post it to this video because I would risk getting a strike earned against my channel. And I just don't want to risk that. And yet, I still feel responsible to put the knowledge and the visuals of what's happened in Iran the past couple weeks out there for for your access. If I can't do it on my own YouTube channel, you of course could do what they used to say about the telephone book, let your fingers do the walking, and follow that link to the video that I hope you all watch. Well, folks, I thank you for the coffee and I thank you for spending your time with me again in another week. Have a phenomenal weekend and enjoy the week that's coming. And this is Steve, the tour guide, signing off. Bye bye.